Welcome back, Time Crunch fans. I'm alongside my guest and fellow CTS coach, Jason Siegle, again to talk to you about the best fueling strategies for gravel versus road racing. To recap quickly from our part one of gravel versus road training, we discussed how the duration and intensity play some really key roles in determining training strategies for the events, along with how really best to train and prepare for each discipline itself. These aspects also play key roles in fueling strategies for the event. So today we're going to focus exclusively on the nutrition and hydration components for gravel versus road. And that is going to help you perform better and have way more fun at every event. So Jason, to kind of set the stage for this episode, I often tell my athletes, no matter how good or bad their training was leading up to the event, their greatest success on race day, especially for the longer event, is going to lie in their fueling strategy. Would you agree with that, or am I off my rocker?
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. I even go as far as saying, our goal on race day is to prevent underperforming, if you
Oh, that's
will,
a good one.
because
Yeah.
if you do it wrong, you're going to underperform because of it. So we're trying to limit how much underperforming happens by doing a good job on the nutrition side.
I'm going to write that down and steal it from you. Yeah, totally agree with that. That's a really good angle on that. And, all that being said, we talk so much about training and intervals and FTP and all that crap. And I haven't had a ton of episodes on like nutrition training, but like a huge aspect here is that the gut is trainable. And so we should talk about how to train the gut.
Well, I mean, just like anything, for the gut, it's more training its tolerance. Can you
Yeah.
eat the volume of food that you want, or does it upset your stomach? So if we're talking training, we're trying to get to where you can eat more without your stomach getting upset at you and then it hurting your performance. I guess basic place to start is like how much should we be eating to begin with?
Hmm.
Um, I generally kind of probably start out with just a calorie goal for most people, and it's not at the extreme of what the body's capable, but I'll say somewhere about 250 calories is sort of a benchmark where I say, hey, this is going to be our starting goal
Like
of
per hour
calories
or
per hour.
okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
per hour. Um, and I generally try to. I would say I do that probably across all workouts, even easy days, just because it's such a process to get it to be habitual. Because for most people, they eat way less than that. And so it's just a
Mhm.
big ask to get them to start doing that and doing it well. So I just like, hey, we're not going to choose so much. We're just going to try to do this all the time. Because ideally, I want them to get to where it just is automatic. They do it and they don't have to think about it. Um, and that's probably the biggest part of nutrition is just getting that where it's just common to be feeding themselves continuously throughout their rides.
Yeah.
And when it comes to like hydration, which is kind of that sister to on the nutrition side, it's for a lot of people that are brand new to this, there's a bit of figuring out what their needs are because they're going to change dramatically based on the environment, the temperature that they're in, whether it's humid, not humid, and then the intensity that they're riding at, and those two sort of act as multipliers. So, if it's hot and you're riding hard, your sweat rate's going to be a lot higher than if it's cold and you're riding hard. So we try to suss that out over time to understand their needs for different conditions and basically use every training as sort of an experiment, if possible, to sort of understand that um, to help them with their event performance. Because like we said to start, like you may be the fittest person ever, but unless your race is really short, like under an hour, if you do a poor job of your nutrition, it's going to hurt your performance in the race to the point where you don't ride to anywhere close to your capacity.
Yeah, exactly. Because the longer you go, the more that's going to play a huge role. And I also like what you said here. I mean, you kept it pretty basic as a starting point of 250 calories per hour. And then for the hydration, dial in your needs. And I think for all of our listeners here, rather than getting into very specifics and kind of like religious guidelines that you never change, that's that that's that's not what we want. What our goal here today is to help equip you so that you can, like Jason said, kind of use every training experience as a bit of a experiment to see what works best for you and go from there. So we'll start with what we know that works, say, in a laboratory setting, but also in the real world, and then you take and run with it. So to double click on a bit of what you said there, Jason, so 250 calories per hour,
Yeah.
is that coming from primarily carbohydrate, or are we just eating a smorgasbord of all the things?
I mean, ideally, it would be as carbohydrate dense as possible. Protein and fat they're not our enemy, but they're not really a fuel source that our body really wants to use to put out watts and to they're only getting used if we don't have the right fuel available, but they also make it harder for us to digest everything that we're digesting at the time.
Yep.
So they're making it harder for us to get the fuel we want. So I try to I try to aim at having someone limit what that is. But I mean, like if you had a Cliff Bar or something like that, it is going to have a little bit of everything, and that doesn't mean Cliff Bar is terrible. It just means that you're going to use it maybe in different situations than you might use some other stuff.
Exactly, exactly. And so when we also think about 250 calories per hour, 1 gram of carbohydrate has about 4 calories, right? So we're
Yeah,
really talking
yeah,
about 60 grams of carbohydrate.
yeah, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then do you tell your athletes to eat their calories, or eat and drink their calories, or just drink their calories?
I kind of say it like this. There's not like a wrong way to get your calories, but there's an intensity that sort of dictates what your options are. Like before, if we're doing VO2 intervals, or you're doing a VO2 effort within a race or something like that, you're probably not taking in fuel, but if you are trying, it's probably only going to be liquid, right? So if your race is, let's just say like a criterium, you're probably not eating a Cliff Bar in a criterium because there's never a point where it's easy enough to do it. So that's dictating your choice. So,
You probably
if we think
crash if
about
you do too,
gravel,
by the way.
yeah, yeah. Um, or you might end up with it in your lung and then you
Yeah.
probably take yourself out of the race because of it or
Yeah.
something. So I like to say you're going to base your nutrition choices on the likelihood of the intensity you're going to be riding at. So, in some road races, you can look at the course and go, well, likely it's going to be steady or easier. Maybe I can eat some, there's going to be a lull in the action. So maybe I can have some solid food here or there. And so you can maybe plan that in. There's other races where you're like, likely it's just going to be on the whole time, and eating a bar isn't really a good choice. We're going to look for more liquid or semi-liquid options for fueling. When we look at gravel, because the pace, generally speaking, is one that we can do all day, that kind of gives us the availability to choose what we prefer. And it doesn't matter as much of whether it's in the drink or if it's solid. Then really the key is, hey, can we get the calories we're after? And will you keep eating it? Is kind of where I end up with it.
Yep, I totally agree with that. And the harder it is, more liquid stuff we go, the longer, less intense it is, the more other stuff we eat. I'd say with any off-road event, and this could be gravel racing as well as what's pretty popular right now, like 50-mile mountain bike races too. They all start super hard. So we're
Hmm.
also not saying eat the Cliff Bar in the first hour of these dirt events. We're hitting sport drink, we're hitting liquid nutrition, and I'm going to encourage people to drink early, drink often, even though it's within that first hour, because the
Right.
less you deplete, the more you put in earlier, the less you deplete over the long run, and the more
Yeah, I
success
always
you'll be.
say you don't want to get behind, right? Like
Right.
we don't get behind. That's that's one of our biggest hurdles. And to that point, like on the fast start in some of these off-road races, that also means like you're in a bunch and it's scary to take your hands off the bar and do too much that way. So you're like considering sort of the terrain, what you're people you're racing against, like how that's going to limit your choices too. Um, so that's an aspect to consider. I mean, if I'm talking just pure racing, I sometimes, like just talk the idea of like, if you're eating a bar, have you cut it up into smaller pieces? Do you have the wrapper open already? Anything you can do to make it so you're spending less time trying to deal with it.
Yeah, for sure.
So dumbing that down makes a big difference too. But yeah, a lot of times the beginning's just so chaotic. Thinking you're going to eat your normal, going to eat a bar just doesn't work out because you're afraid to take your hands off the handlebar.
Exactly. And before we get into like some of those like nuanced and specific stuff, I'm gonna go kind of like double click on the hydration aspect because
Sure.
there's liquid calories in there. There's also electrolytes, and this is probably going to be one of the more wide ranging aspects that we can dial in because, like you said, hydration in 60 degrees is very different than 96 degrees. So, what kind of ballpark guidelines would you give to our audience from an electrolyte standpoint? And is that coming primarily through drink, or are you taking salt pills, or jacking yourself on pickle juice, or what?
When it comes to, if we're going to talk to like electrolytes, generally it's maybe, I mean, the main one is sodium. The other electrolytes aren't a huge concern. And even sodium, I mean, with the way research has continued to go, maybe is less of a concern than we once would have thought. So, I mean, replacing some, I think, is useful because it just seems that we absorb the food we're taking in a little bit easier if there is some sodium attached. But does it have to be crazy? Probably not. So for me, I'm focusing less on that because if they're doing the other sports nutrition stuff, it generally is having enough sodium that it's not coming up, but generally 200 to 600 milligrams an hour, somewhere in that range, is sufficient. Um, and the research is tending to agree that that isn't making a huge difference on the outcome for someone's race performance or even training performance.
Yeah, I agree. I would say to that point, don't overlook it. But we used to say more is better, so don't worry about the upper end. But I'd say, um, I mean, if you're trying to consume 1.5 grams of sodium per hour, that's a little too much. There's just like the saltiness, there's the flavor
Yeah,
itself, and you'll have some GI issue if it's dependent on the sodium type. So, um,
and I mean, as your calorie needs increase too, that becomes more challenging. Like
yeah.
how many different things you're trying to put through your gut start to limit it. So that comes into play potentially.
Exactly. But that 200 to 600, I think that's really good. And if you read some of the latest stuff, especially from like Oscar Zuckenrup and things, they're focused primarily on carbohydrate intake.
Yeah.
So, but
Yeah.
don't overlook electrolytes.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of where you're getting it, most people, if you're drinking a sports drink, that's
Yeah.
going to be your primary source. You
Yep.
probably don't have to really worry about looking elsewhere for it then. Most drinks have close to that amount just in 20 ounces of fluid. In most cases, that's probably where we're starting, say somewhere around a bottle an hour. In really hot conditions, you may need quite a bit more. In cold conditions, you may need less. But again, that's where you use your regular training to kind of suss that out ahead of time. I guess I'll speak just a little bit on that. The easiest way for me with the athletes I work with is you just do a pre-weight and a post-weight, and we're looking at the difference. Their weight
Body weight is
pre,
what you're saying.
yeah,
Yeah.
body weight before and after. And there used to sort of get talked about like, hey, there's like, you don't want to lose more than this percent because your performance is going to decrease. And I don't really speak to it that way anymore. I kind of speak to it in it like how easy it's going to be ready for your next training session. So if we minimize the deficit, like we have less to overcome in terms of recovery, like that recovery process becomes a little bit more manageable.
Mhm.
When it comes to the longer races, I mean, there's a degree of which if we get too dehydrated, it's going to compound and we're going to overheat, and our core temperature is going to be a limiter in what we can do. So, um, but it gets pretty nuanced on the longer stuff and how you might look at some of that. But generally speaking, I'm like, hey, if we can minimize it to less than 2 pounds of weight loss, then I know we're doing a pretty good job. And then to be ready for the next thing we're doing isn't going to take days, we can solve that within an afternoon and evening and be ready for the next day. And we just don't want to overdrink. Like you can overdrink too. So if you're gaining weight, we're drinking too much. Want to avoid that too.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, those are good actionable things to take away for sure. Let's get into some of the racing and training, like how we actually do this and what fuel
Sure.
choices are out there. So during a race, like we'll remain brand neutral on this podcast, but give some examples out there that your athletes are using that you can use during, let's just take a gravel race, for example, but like a high intensity part of it. So like the first hour and then
Yeah.
like later on, like what kind of stuff are we aiming for?
Right now, kind of the most popular for the higher intensity stuff are these higher calorie drinks. Martens drink mix. SIS has one called Beta Fuel. Scratch has like one they call Super Fuel. And really, the goal is they get you is maximizing what your stomach can handle and have it in a form that's easy for your gut to deal with too. So you can get it all in essentially a one bottle of any of those drinks per hour gets you close to what your stomach can deal with. And since it's in a drink, it's easy to get it down and into the system and getting it to the muscles then.
Yeah, exactly. So have you been using with your athletes like the higher calorie sport drinks?
Yeah, I find they're tending to work pretty well. Maybe there's a mix of where you maybe even make like a super strong bottle, so they go between that and water, depending on the hydration needs. So, some of these really long races that are super hot, you just need so much fluid that you need plain fluid. Otherwise, you take in way too many calories. So you're kind of doing that. I mean, the biggest thing is like having a good game plan and planning out, hey, this is my needs. These are the conditions that I'm having to contend with, and what's the best approach? How can I meet the needs? And sometimes that's I like the drink and that makes it easier. Then there's others where I don't like the taste of it, so I'd rather eat something. And so you just have to figure out that balance where you're still getting the calories you need and the hydration you need to go with it.
Having the good game plan, like you said, and the gut is trainable. Like I'll keep on pulling on these threads because every training session is an experimental session for your gut as well. And every time
Hmm.
that the environmental conditions change, you get feedback from your body of did this work or did this not? And
Yep.
then additionally, if we're doing our training right, we're doing long training and stuff, you'll also get feedback from like your taste buds, from your gut of like what you want when. So besides like a super high carb drink mix, like what's some of the food stuff that your athletes or you're using on like late in the game?
So I'll preface this with one thing and you kind of mentioned it, is like your taste buds. So as day goes longer, you kind of get a little more sensitive to sweetness. So like something that's maybe mild in the beginning starts to be almost too much later on. So that may come into your food choice. So some of like the really high calorie drinks might just be off-putting because you're like, oh, that's way too sweet anymore. So you might go to something that's a little more savory or just you know, not not just pure sugar kind of thing. So it's either maybe going to like a bar or rice bar sort of thing. I have a lot of people that like the chews too, just because the dose, you can make the dose so much smaller. And if the dose is small enough, then it's not overpowering. And then that just means you do it maybe a little more frequently.
Yep.
Um, but there tends to be a transition from like the really sugary things people just don't want later on because they've either just had too many calories at that point because it's been a long day, or they don't like the taste of the sweetness anymore.
Yeah. I mean, it's like an emotional palate or palate fatigue, right? My
Hmm.
quick hack is if you're doing a long ride, you stop into a gas station. My go to is Cheez Its, especially like spicy Cheez Its. Just like brings me back. Also, like a pickle juice or like a spicy pickle. Do that in a Red Bull, you'd be flying. Um, so, we'll keep on talking about some examples here as we get this going. We mentioned stopping and starting, or sorry, stopping and not stopping when it comes to gravel and road racing.
Sure.
And those are
Sure.
some pretty big aspects when it comes to fueling and how you carry things and how you're going to plan to get your fuel throughout. So, can you talk about like, uh, I don't know, just that the whole aspect of, gravel training, gravel racing, and the fact that you actually get to stop, reload the bike, the pockets, where you carry it, and then maybe if you don't, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first place to start is deciding if you're going to stop, you got to figure out like what are your choices there, because it might not be all the stuff that you would start with, the special nutrition, like throwback to Unbound, you're in the middle of Kansas at a seven, if you stopped at at Casey's or whatever in the middle of nowhere, they might not have, your scratch drink or whatever else. You're going to have to maybe have tried out some of those other things. So you may be just practicing eating some regular food, see what of those you can tolerate.
And that's where the gas station, you know, comes wildly into good use, is because you roll up and you got to make your best decision on what your body's telling you. But also, like, don't get super emotional. Don't go for like 3 hot dogs that have been cooking there all day. It's not going to be a good outcome in the
Yeah, I
next 30
mean, probably
minutes.
the biggest thing is just being smart on the dose.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. But
the usually those stops tend to lead to someone just throwing a whole bunch in, and then
right,
then it kind of comes back to bite them. So it's like, hey, that stuff can work and be fine, but be careful of the dose. So
for sure. And
pace it out.
yep, pace it out, and that comes too with like the experience. But I guess my point is, like, if you're doing a half a hot dog or a half a bag of Cheez-Its and some Red Bull or something like that, you put that in the first time, you're maybe like, ooh, well, I don't know if that was a good choice. But the second time you do, it's like, oh yeah, that's a great choice. And then all of a sudden you realize that your gut can really handle anything, as long as it's not like super new or a super high dose of something. And that's really
Right.
important for when you're, riding or racing for 12 freaking hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to be thinking about kind of on that same front is just how much of that stuff you're planning to carry. So like, do you want to have is that a last resort, or is that something you're planning into your strategy so you don't have to carry as much? So coming up with your plan on how you're going to attack it, because there's plenty of people that they'll just carry enough to get to the first stop, and just that way they don't have to carry much. And then there's the other, sort of boat where you carry all your stuff so you never have to stop ever. You have everything to and there's pluses and minuses to both. I mean, the most immediate to me is if you don't stop, then you don't lose any time where you're not moving, right? So if you're always moving forward, then you're covering ground. But at the same time, um, that maybe isn't the best strategy if everybody else is stopping, and then you have to go do all the work on your own. Maybe you're now working harder than you would have if you had waited. So there's a bit of weighing of options on that front as
Yep.
well. But
Yeah.
that's becoming more and more on the gravel side, like a big decision. I mean, you'll see at Unbound the kind of talk of like the aid stations now is like a NASCAR pit where you're just trying to get in and get out pretty efficiently and fast, where before someone might hang out for 2 or 3 minutes and it wasn't a big deal. So there's a bit of a shift in the tactics that are being employed.
And I'd say for anybody on this podcast listening, though, like, stop. My go-to is like, stop, but don't hang out for the 5-10 minutes. It's like, stop, be really efficient with what you do, and communicate. Like, if you're in a group, communicate with them, because they probably want to stop as well, but it's going to be advantageous. Like Jason said, it's like, if you just blow through and they stop, well, now you're just solo and you're not working together and you're not efficient, all this kind of stuff. But if you all stop together, bottles, okay, grab a Coke, handful of that, boom, and go. That's a really good strategy. And so I'd encourage, if you're doing these gravel races and events, like, be talkative out there, form some friends, form an alliance. And that's gonna be really good. I'd say to that point though, Jason, like, you won't have your special super secret high carb whatever out there on course, but you
Right.
can carry it. In fact, like, the gravel bikes are coming more equipped with places to stash stuff. You got cargo pockets happening on our bib shorts
Sure.
these days too. Like, are you utilizing these pockets and storage things more readily with gravel racers, or what are you doing there?
Yeah, mainly because it seems to be easier to get to them, and like so that increases the likelihood that you use and keep up with your nutrition. So as much as side pockets like on bibs seem silly, it's in most cases it's easier to get something out of that than it is to get it out of your back pocket on your jersey. Same thing, you have a top tube bag. A lot of people find that just so much easier to use that it's like, hey, like the nutrition only helps us if we can get it, if we can eat it, right?
Yeah.
So anything that goes to improve that, the ability for you to keep up, that's that's really the name of the game. So I find those sort of things to be surprisingly useful. I mean, I never would have thought it was this that it would be so easy to use, but to have like a fork mounted water bottle, I'd never tried it, and I did a bike packing trip, and I was like blown away. Like for some, that's maybe a really excellent option. It's almost easier than sometimes when the bottle's on the down tube really close down to the crank, that can be a hard reach, and the one on the fork is like you don't even bend over. So anything
Yeah.
you can do to sort of simplify that, I think, is useful.
Wildly agree. And you might have some roadie friends that are poo-pooing your cargo pant pocket or the water bottle cage down there. But like, let's face it, like I've also seen people late in a road race or late in a gravel race, and they're trying to reach around into their pocket, and they're getting like shoulder cramps because, oh my gosh, so
And they just give up and don't eat, right?
right? Or they ask their friends, like, "Can you reach into my pocket?" And so, like, hey, get an open mind. Like we're getting creative out there with where to put stuff on the bike. It doesn't always have to be, right there in the back. You roadies, not to
Yeah, there's this bit of tradition in what's like, the Euro or the cool way to look,
right,
and
right.
some of that's, I mean, top two bags or bottle in the rear pocket are being shown to be more aero, so it's kind of throwing some a wrench into some, old school thought mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, and I love it. And I'll read the memes all day and crack jokes myself. But the reality is of having a good, successful day out there. Yeah, start to use some of these new concepts that are being really, evolved out of the gravel racing. I think it's great. Boy, man, we covered a lot on today's episode, and we started with some generalities with the nutrition and hydration considerations. I like that you did it that way. I like the starting point of 250 calories per hour, or around 60 grams of carbohydrate. Kind of in summary, I would say for athletes to start there, learn what works for them. We talked about some hydration with the electrolytes being added in, but like, what are some of the, before we summarize, but like, what would be the higher end of the grams of carbohydrate intake or the calories that people could kind of shoot for or kind of stay within? And dare I say, ounces of hydration if we gave them guidelines?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so for grams of carbohydrate, I would say somewhere around 90 is kind of on the top end. You may see that maybe there is some people that will gravitate even a little bit north of that in terms of grams per hour. Um, so 90 if you can get to 90, I would say you're doing a good job. Hydration, if it's hot, you might be getting to where you're 50 ounces an hour
Mhm.
to keep up. Maybe more if it's like really high intensity, which just becomes challenging because how do you get that? How do you carry it?
Right.
Um, so those would be kind of like the high end. The hydration side you can test. So you hopefully go and do rides and figure out what those needs look like. The calorie is going to be what I do with athletes is I will pick, if we're going to try to get the stomach to get better at it, we'll pick their biggest, longest ride of the week and maybe it's just one of the days, maybe it's both, and we'll go, okay, we're good at 60. This week we're going to do 65. And if we do a 65 and there's zero problems, you don't feel any worse, you feel totally good, then maybe the next week we'll do another five. we get to a point where you're like, I felt kind of queasy, maybe we'll spend a couple of weeks there. We'll just stepwise build um, towards that 90. If possible, I'll even, if we get to 90, maybe try to go a little bit above and then come back down to 90 for your race if possible.
Yeah. And as you described that, and when I was drafting up some of this outline too, I was like, man, training the gut is a lot like just training the human, right? It's a progressive
Hmm.
overload sort of approach that we go with, where we start somewhere, we build up to a point where it might be a little too much, and then we dial it back and then find that happy place where we go and race. So, let that sink in for everybody, and also take Jason's advice of every training session is a bit of an experimental learning opportunity to see what works with your gut. Start with that 250 per hour. Start with the ounces that he recommended. Don't forget the electrolytes, but like do this in training so that it's not new on race day. And I think with that too, you'll find that, hey, this package is really hard to open, so I'm going to open that up and put it in my little top tube bag before I get out there, right? And I'm going to use my cargo pockets because Coach Jason said it was pretty rad, even though the roadies make fun of me. Jason,
It gets hard if you're a roadie going over to gravel.
oh, it's
It's hard to
brutal.
get past some of those things. But if
Yeah,
you're a gravel rider first, then you'll see all that at the start line, and there's less of a barrier.
yeah, you ain't be caring at that point. So, yeah, anything you want to add to those summary points, Jason?
No, I mean, I think the biggest thing is you got to experiment. So
Yeah,
there's some there's kind of a good place to start, but like everyone's stomach is a little bit different. What you like is going to be very individual. Just, realize, hey, what we're trying to do is get mostly carbohydrate and, ideally dose it out so it's not all at once. Small doses are tend to be easier, both of hydration and of the calories, and experiment and record what your experiment is. Don't take notes on your rides, because if you want to look back and you 2 months down the road, you're not going to remember that you had, one bottle of Scratch and two Snickers bars and three pretzels. Like, you just won't remember. So keep track of it so that you can use it in the future.
yeah, those are wise words, and keeping track of that in training peaks is both helpful for you and your coach. Because I even have some athletes who, like, the Saturday long ride happens. We talk on Monday. I'm like, so what'd you take in? It's like, um, four
Right.
bottles. What did I do?
Yeah, we have short memories on
It's
this stuff. We
crazy.
think we could remember it, but we just don't.
Yeah, so having that log is wildly important, but the experimental aspect is really what we want to bring home to you guys today. So start with the recommendations that we gave. Jason, thank you again for being on the podcast once again. I learned a lot in this episode, and I hope our audience did too. If they want to see more of Jason or reach out to you, what's the best method to have audience members reach out?
Through CTS, you could just Siegle at trainwright.com. Otherwise, you probably find me with Jason Siegle on most social
Yep.
platforms. It's just first and last name, and
I personally
that's
like
probably the best way.
following Jason on TikTok. His dance videos are crazy good. So you can just kidding. Jason likes riding bikes, not doing dance videos. But yeah, check him out, folks. And we'll put his contact information in the show notes. He's great for coach consultation, nutrition consultation, road, gravel, really anything with two wheels. This guy can help you out. So, Jason, thanks again for being on the Time Crunch Cyclist podcast, and for our audience, thank you for listening,
Thanks for
rating,
having
and
me.
review us. Yeah, thanks, Jason.